Evelyn Lee, FAIA, is the current first Vice President-elect of the American Institute of Architects and will serve as the president of the organization in 2025. She is the first global head of the workplace strategy and innovation.
Oh, that's old. That's okay. I left. I've since left, but that's okay.
Oh, no. Okay. And the founder of the Practice of Architecture and co-host of the podcast, Practice Disrupted.
Yeah.
Okay. She's a member of NOMA and is the first female elected to treasurer of the AIA. That will always be true.
That will always be true.
Lee integrates her background in architecture and business, merging qualitative and quantitative worlds. She is widely published, managing a monthly column for Contract Magazine, is a contributor to Architect Magazine, and many other online platforms.
Yes.
She's a keynote speaker, invited guest, panelist, moderator at National Design and Architecture conferences, including AIA National, Dwell on Design, and Women in Green. Evelyn received her Bachelor of Architecture degree with honors in 2002 from Drury University, yay, where she minored in global studies while playing on the women's soccer team. In 2003, she received her Master of Architecture from SciArc, the Southern California Institute of Architecture. In 2021, she finished a dual MPA, Master in Public Administration, MBA, Master in Business Administration, and Sustainable Management from Presidio Graduate School. In her role at AIA, she is looking to strengthen the profession for future generations, find ways to re-engage those who have chosen other career paths after design education, and determine ways to share research across the profession. Please help me welcome Evelyn Lee. Thank you.
Okay. Can you all hear me? This is kind of working? Okay, so this is going to be a little bit different, I hope, than your average lecturer. I left traditional practice shortly after I got licensed, so it's not going to be so much about the work that I'm doing, but it is going to be about the work that a lot of others are doing beyond architecture, as well as what you could potentially be doing with your degrees. So I am managing 2 computers right now, so if what I'm saying does not match my slides, let me know. And like any good architect, I have like 70 slides for a 60-minute presentation, so we'll see how fast we can get through these. So how many of you, this is a very quick slide, see? How many of you caught Barbie? Really? Okay. Thought a little more. Summer blockbusters, guys. You guys aren't in school, you're not in studio. Anyone catch Oppenheimer? Anyone do the Barbieheimer double feature? Okay, a few. Anybody follow Dank Lloyd Wright on Instagram? So Dank Lloyd Wright created this Venn diagram of me. So I guess we're both LinkedIn bosses, but I did grow up in Los Alamos, New Mexico, which is where Oppenheimer, where the Los Alamos National Lab is. And in the center, they say we're all product of corporate America. I like to show that for fun, but I also like to redraw my own Venn diagram. So I'm a mom of 2 littles. I have a 6-year-old and an 8-year-old. I am I'm a licensed architect. I earned my FAIA 3 years ago now. But I'm also deeply vested in technology, and I most recently just finished working 5 years at Slack Technologies. Does anyone heard of Slack? A few head nods. Do you guys know what Teams is? Do you guys use Teams at all? Google Chat? So very similar, but it's for a company called Slack. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about my career and how I went from architecture into tech, talk about the new business landscape and why architects, not just students, but actually architects and practice leaders need to be looking at different ways to have an architectural practice, talk about new practice models, look at some people that are doing things beyond practice, and what it looks like beyond architecture. So I thought I'd start about designing a career. So this is the public library in my hometown in Los Alamos. It was designed by Antoine Predock, I don't know why that timer is up there now, sorry, we'll turn that off, who recently passed away. But I was one of those people that always knew I wanted to be an architect ever since 4th grade. My teacher said, draw your dream house, and everybody kind of drew the elevation of a dream house, and I drew a plan. I played soccer, so it included an indoor soccer field, enough bedrooms for all of my friends to sleep over, and we each had like a TV and a Nintendo in the room. But I was one of those architects until I became an architect, and I decided this really wasn't my path. So we'll be looking a little bit at my educational journey, how that relates to architecture, what I do as a writer, what that means for the architecture and beyond traditional practice, and talk a little bit about technology. And I want to talk a little bit about building a portfolio career. So a portfolio career is probably not language that you hear that often from people in the AEC or architecture, engineering, and construction industry. It is something that I feel people outside of architecture are talking a lot more about. And it's because unlike the generations that have come before us, where you're expected to have a career at one place and kind of advance through leadership, more people today are having careers that expand multiple industries, or they have multiple different income streams where they have a practice and they also teach, or maybe they're an author. But this idea of building a portfolio career, I think, is more accepted. People are looking less at how many different jobs you're jumping through on your resume, and they're really asking the question, well, what is each job that you're moving to giving you in terms of experience to prepare you for the role that we need you in? So it's just a different way of looking at your overall career trajectory. I feel that, I talked to some students at lunch, and one of the things that I felt coming out of architecture school is there's this one linear path forward. Everybody was asking me, where am I in my IDP or AXP hours? They were asking me, how many AREs have I finished? And as soon as you get licensed, then it's like, well, where are you in the firm, and when are you going to become firm leader? But I think the truth about careers in architecture is it doesn't have to be linear. It can be quite the opposite. So I just want to place an emphasis on that. So I did start off very much in traditional practice. I Drury University, which I would say is a very tectonic school. Did my graduate, my master's at SciArc, which is much more theoretical. Went and worked for 2 firms, WD Partners and a smaller firm that was recently acquired by Perkins Eastman. They were called Dougherty & Dougherty Architects, doing K-12 schools in California. The interesting thing about doing K-12 schools in California is that it's in a low bid environment. And what that means is that the contractor is selected they're pre-qualified, but they're selected by whoever submits the lowest bid. They win the job. So in a lot of my jobs, I had one job, I had a separate contract, the contractor set up a separate job site trailer that was literally going through our drawings looking for mistakes so they could change order their way to a profit. And I was like, this is not a really fun environment to be in as an architect, where essentially contractors are just looking for your mistakes and putting you in like really difficult situations with your client because of it. And I just didn't like how our buildings were getting built. I was really questioning, is this the right place for me to be? I don't know if I've never honestly been the best designer, so where do I fit into the world of architecture? I also started writing at that time for Inhabitat before people believed you could make a living writing for blogs, but that's when my writing journey started too. And then next, I went and I got my MPA and my MBA, but a lot of it was because it was the right time in my life to explore other things. I wanted to take a break from architecture. I wanted to test out, is there other career paths I could be pursuing? It was actually a really hard decision to make because I wanted to be an architect ever since I was that 4th grade girl. And then I also really struggled because everyone's like, you got your license, what are you doing stepping off this long path? And I think a lot of us forget that, even though we've been on this path for a while, everything that we've learned and accumulated over that time will help us get to the next step, even if we decide to follow a new career journey. So ultimately, I left architecture and I went and worked for a nonprofit organization. And in doing that, I decided to go back to school. And what I learned getting my MBA was that there was all of these articles about business and marketing and how to run a practice that I wish that I had in my architecture education. So I spun up Practice of Architecture as a way to share all the learnings that I was learning outside of architecture to an architecture audience. When I left school, I ended up at a place called MK Think. So MK Think was your standard design practice. It was actually Miller Keller Architects. But they added Think, which was part of what they call a strategy studio. And it was meant to look at how do we expand what we're doing outside the traditional services that we are performing for architects. So it was looking at expanding the definition of what it means to be an architect and practice architecture. And we were doing a lot more interesting things, in my mind, working with clients directly outside of the building, and a lot more community engagement, which was the things that really made me excited. I didn't see a lot of growth in the firm, so I jumped around to Newmark and Savile Study doing workplace strategy, but it was essentially working with organizations like the Nature Conservancy and others that were pre-pandemic looking at how do we save on real estate but continue to grow our people while spending less money on real estate. And that's when I ended up ultimately at Slack. So Slack is interesting. It's like Teams, like I said. It's kind of like Google Chat, which most people would generally think that Slack was a fully remote company because of our product. But but pre-pandemic, we were only about 3% remote. We have these gorgeous award-winning commercial offices, and that's where I tended to work in. But when the pandemic happened, Slack went entirely remote, and my job shifted, and I became the head of workplace innovation and future of work. And what that meant was that I was really looking at the operations processes and policies around what it's like for employees to work in a remote environment. So, for example, we would create norms around everybody actually, instead of using the one Zoom at the head of the table, we would create norms like where everyone opens up their laptops. So for the people that couldn't call in or be there with us physically, we were each showing up like a little tile in Zoom. So and then we made decisions around vacation time. Ultimately, we got acquired by Salesforce that has unlimited vacation, but we were making decisions around how often to have meetings and stuff like that, and providing our managers with training to help them navigate through this new hybrid environment that the pandemic put us in. And this is where I am now. So I left Slack, and I'm kind of bridging Slack or technology and architecture. So Practice of Architecture has evolved. It's become a business consultancy for small and medium-sized architecture firms to help them on the business side of practice. We have a podcast called Practice Disrupted, where a lot of the people that I'm featuring today, you can actually go in and listen to their podcast. That's how I've gotten to meet them. And we host a community called the Practice Community Plus Lab that has a lot of future next generation leaders in there talking about how they want to run practice differently or how they want to have a different career in architecture. And just last week, ArchDaily listed us as one of the 2024 up-and-coming new best practices, even though it's 10 years old, but I didn't let them know that. But the other thing that I'm doing is I am an angel investor, and then there's a number of technology firms in the AEC space that I support as a startup advisor. So that's where I am now. So we will transition. And then I continue to write. So sorry, I know what's happening with my slides. I think I have a 2-second transition time built in there, which is why it's so slow. But one of the things I did want to point out is that writing has been a constant throughout my career. I now write for Architizer, and also my involvement with the AIA has been a constant in terms of my professional network. And I've never had to apply. I only applied to a job once when I was getting out of school, and I would have to say that every other job since then is because of my AIA network. This is some of my articles from Architizer. There's actually a 3-part series, and it talks about culture in schools, but it talks about the evolution of how culture and practice needs to evolve. So this is actually a provocative statement warning for practitioners, but I thought I would throw this in here for you guys. This is how I opened up a conversation a long time ago, saying that as architects, we are 3 recessions away from being extinct. I looked up the first time I ever said this, and it was for my opening line in a keynote for Contract Magazine. It was actually the day that Trump was announced president, oddly enough, in 2016. But this was back in 2016. And one of the reasons why I said that was because this is where we were in 2016. So we were just emerging out of the Great Recession. And we find that anytime architects go into a recession, the people who leave, who get fired from their architecture jobs, don't always tend to come back. So the profession and the industry as a whole contracts because we lose those people to other job opportunities that they find, and they never come back. So we lost another generation of architects. But also there was growing interest from VCs and private equity to invest in the AEC, and then they threw in O, which is the owner space. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. The interesting thing is this trend continues. So in 2020, we were in the midst of the Great Resignation, where people were rethinking mental health and well-being. There was a lot of layoffs and movement happening around. Firms were figuring out how to survive during a pandemic. And the companies that had invested previously were now starting, or the VCs that had invested into companies in the AEC space were now actually big enough that they were starting to hire people out of architecture firms to work for them in the technology field. And then 2022 came around, and many firms were struggling with a talent shortage. Return to office conversations, I think, have forced people to leave firms that had less flexible workplace policies. And employees, especially the incoming generations, thank goodness for Gen Z, I think are really expecting more out of employers than they ever had before. And in 2023, there have been layoffs in some of the larger cities from architecture firms. The culture of architecture keeps getting called into question. The first firm in New York actually started a union and unionized in 2023. And then AI became mainstream, and architects are still trying to understand what that means. The other thing, and I had a really long conversation with Michael Speaks, who is the dean at Syracuse University, is that this is what he likes to tell the parents of incoming students, but also incoming students, that the architecture degree is the ultimate liberal arts degree. The other thing that I'm seeing from a lot of deans, and I'd be interested to hear from Karen, but we're finding that more people are pursuing architecture or coming and pursuing an architecture degree without any thought of going into traditional practice afterwards because they see the value in the degree. So here are some other things that are happening outside of architecture. This slide actually needs to be updated more recently, but all of the major consulting companies have started acquiring design firms because they have figured out the importance of design thinking throughout their organization. Now, what usually happens when one of these large consulting firms acquires another company, it usually sits in their own silo. Like if they acquired a healthcare company, that healthcare company would continue to do its work, it would just do it under a new name. The interesting thing with these design companies is that they're being integrated unilaterally on teams across the entire organization because they see design as an important aspect of all of their work they're doing. So they're not just standing as these little standalone silos. So these are design companies that have been acquired. None of these are necessarily a standalone architecture group, but they do, like some of them did do wayfinding and other design and community, and a lot of them did community engagement work. This slide also needs to be updated too. 2023 was a rough year for venture capital, but venture capital or VC investment in the AEC space has skyrocketed and grown more quickly than any other industry. They see what is going on and how the lack of how we put together buildings and construct buildings have changed over time. And they see there's like a really great opportunity there to figure out how do we increase efficiency, especially on the building site. So when you look at where a lot of this money is getting spent, it's actually getting spent on the C side of AEC. But that's beginning to shift a little bit more, and I'll talk about some companies that are looking to support architects. I can skip through these. So if you guys are interested in where money is getting invested into the architecture space through these venture capital funds, these are the major ones that have a focus on the building industry. What a lot of architects don't know is that every major national general contracting firm also has a VC group. So even the general contractors are saying, this is an opportunity for us, and they're investing money into this space, which is changing the business landscape, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. So here's the takeaways. We are no longer competing against ourselves for talent and for work, mostly because all of these people are leaving architecture, but all of these new ways of working in the AEC space are taking the talent too. And there's two different ways that we can approach this. We can approach it as a threat, which is where I feel most architects have seemed to be operating from. I would like to approach it as an opportunity. So these are new practice models. They may not seem that interesting at first. It picks up, I promise. The reason why I like to include Jennifer Kretschmer is she's a sole practitioner that does homes in California. They're not like necessarily amazing award-winning homes. She's not necessarily somebody that you would bring in for a lecture, but she has a network of all other sole practitioners that are working nationally to support one another and help each other on projects with the construction documents. So if she finds that she has too much on her plate because she has too much work coming in, she's working with one of my friends in Detroit, for instance, who it might be slow, and they're working with each other to support one another so that they can both have thriving practices, but not have to grow any staff. And so that's just an example of that. FAIA, I do recommend everyone check out. So FAIA is a women-owned firm. They are an entirely remote architecture firm. So it doesn't matter if you guys are here in Mississippi, you could work for FAIA. They are also, they're a JUST company, so they recently earned their JUST certification, and they are a B Corp. They were entirely remote pre-pandemic. It was a decision that they made so they can hire the talent, the best talent, no matter where they live. But the founder also just didn't want to be tied down to an office, which has actually helped her because she has been able to move from California up to Washington to support her family as needed. The other thing is they have a wonderful scholarship. I don't know when it closes or if it already closed, but every year they have a scholarship for a minority student where they offer an internship for the summer along with an additional $5,000 scholarship money for the next semester, and they offer a part-time job for that student while they're in school if they want to continue working for them. And if you go to their website, they have the most transparent salary I have ever seen out of any architecture firm. They publish it clearly, the starting rate for when you come in, and they are very transparent about how you grow above and beyond that starting rate. So a truly equitable firm, they work in sustainable, affordable multifamily housing, which I think is a very hard vertical to work in when people think about a remote office. Most people think, oh, you're a remote office, you must do high-end residential. They do a lot of community-based work, even though they're a remote firm. And they only actually work 4 days a week, because on the 5th day, they allow people to pursue their own interests and do research. So you still have to work, but you get to pursue your own interests. And a lot of what Engage Fora is actually a new business that spun out of Fora Architects, where they're actually getting paid to do more community engagement. And this was part of a pet project that grew out of one of the research projects that one of their team members created. So they're open for growing opportunities. Mass is in here because I think what most people don't realize is Mass is a 501c3. Did you guys know that? Or the difference in the structure? So some of you are saying yes. So we had a podcast with them on not the designers, but the business operators of Mass to talk about how they run their firm differently as a 501c3 rather than a for-profit company, and how it enables them to get different funds from different sources that regular standard firms actually can't get funds from. So it's just purely from a business model, I think it's a really interesting case because they have access to, say, foundation dollars that other firms actually don't have access to because of the way they're structured. Now we're getting a little wider. So Slantis is by 2 women who graduated MIT. They are in Uruguay, and a lot of architecture firms actually outsource to them. But they're trying to help firms beef up their technology. So they're supporting architects by doing like all of the construction documents and stuff, but they're building in tools on their end to automate as much of that as they can, which enables the architects that contract with them to really spend more time than they ever have in the design process and less time on construction documents, which was my least favorite part about working in a firm. Mobile Makers was started by somebody that was young, out of college. She was struggling. It was Maya Bird while she was in Chicago. She was struggling to get hired during the recession. She managed to get on as a marketing manager, and she wanted to do more in her community. So she redid a food truck, created this Camp on Wheels, and created this mobile maker organization. So this is somebody that was relatively fresh out of college. I actually think she started developing this while she was in school a little bit, now she has a space in Chicago, and she also has more food trucks / design trucks going around Boston, and she's on faculty at BSA, where she's integrating, doing more of these community engagements with youth. So now we're going to go a little bit more beyond practice. So Layer is a technology company. It was developed out of an architecture firm. It is developed by an architect that allows you to leave notes in your Revit. So right now, a way a lot of firms operate is you have your Revit model, and then you have all your notes about your project in like Word or Google Docs or somewhere else. Even though you might be talking about a specific aspect of your model, the notes live somewhere else. So this enables you to have all of your notes that you take on site in your Revit model. And it was developed out of an architecture firm, so by architects for architects. Cove Tool is developed as a technology company. All of these, by the way, are SaaS tools. Do you guys know what SaaS means? It's a tech term. It means software as a service. So any software that you pay a subscription to, Netflix is a SaaS. It's because you essentially have it's software on your hardware machine that you pay a regular subscription service to. So all of these companies, their business models, for the most part, are SaaS. They're tech companies. Cove Tool was started by two engineer/architects. It's a husband and wife team, and his brother, who does all the coding. But they were working for Perkins and Will out of New York. And they were running all of these environmental scans for all the projects for Perkins and Will. But it took them a long time to do it for each project. And they're like, if we want to change the future of how buildings are and how sustainable buildings are, we need to create a tool that enables the sole proprietors, the small firms, the medium-sized firms to run the same type of models that Perkins and Will is getting companies to pay a lot of money for. So that's what they did. They developed a tool to allow more people to run sustainable energy models in Revit overlaid. Concert is a company that was started by the Large Firm Roundtable. So the Large Firm Roundtable is made up of 40 of the largest firms in the US. And what Concert does is, because so much of what we do now happens in digital space, they use a similar to blockchain to essentially create a moment. They document the moment in time as architects have finalized this drawing and this has been approved for us to move on to the next step. But it essentially keeps track of who owns what documentation throughout the process. And they're using blockchain, which is essentially what crypto uses, to keep a running ledger of who owns what for architects. And this will become continuously more important as we move to digital documentation. HighPart. Has anybody used Photoshop's kind of regenerative AI where you can circle a place and say, like, put a sign here and it puts a sign there? So HighPart started off as a grasshopper kind of consultancy where they help architecture firms develop efficiencies within their models by writing scripts for them. But a little less known, they're working on what regenerative AI looks like in your Revit model. So imagine, similar to Photoshop, saying, put in a staircase here, and the Revit model dropping in a staircase and opening up the floor and calculating all of that just by you saying, drop in a staircase here. So this is the group that is beginning to work towards that. There's nowhere near that, but this is one of the first groups that I know that are trying to work towards that. Monograph is a project management company from architects that left architecture and said, we are horrible project managers. So they built out a really gorgeous project management software. And Kanoa is interesting. So Kanoa was founded by Kanoa was one of the founders. It's really interesting has anyone watched like the WeWork documentaries and have seen the progression of WeWork at all? Anyone? A few of you. So it's been really interesting to see what has happened to the real estate team at WeWork. So Kanoa was started by, he's an ex-shop person out of New York. He ran a Revit consultancy that was acquired by WeWork, and he got a lot of money in WeWork and he exited before the downfall. So it's been really interesting to see what all of these exits from WeWork have done for people in the real estate space. Kanoa they're actually targeting interior designers and designers. But essentially right now, when you buy commercial furniture, when you do workplace interiors, you have to go through a dealer. And then the dealer puts in the order to the manufacturer. And when you have a conversation with the owner might okay everything. And then by the time you go and talk to the dealer, you might find that they're out of that colorway, that because of supply chain, they can't deliver. a piece in time. There's any number of different things that can happen between getting an approval from the owner and getting back information from the manufacturer to say whether or not it's available. Kanoa has a direct tie to the manufacturer, and their software is free. Any of you could go and create an account. You can literally drag and drop your floor plan on there, drag and drop furniture in at scale, and similar to Amazon or any place else, it creates a virtual cart for you, and when you hit purchase, it purchases directly from the dealer and delivers it, or from the manufacturer and delivers it on site. So it cuts out a lot of these conversations that architects actually had no control over because they were having to check in with the dealer, who then checked in with the manufacturer if a piece was actually available. But essentially they've taken the Miro space that you can operate, like the whiteboard space, and created a very easy way to make like color recommendations or actually turn like a really well done project board into a literal shopping cart that you just hit purchase on. So TestFit was interesting. TestFit was started by somebody, I want to say he was at UT Austin. He's out of Texas. He started this when he was in school. He spent one summer internship with a developer doing pro forma drawings, and he also spent another internship working for an architect doing storage shed design. And he was really sick of using Control-C, Control-V, copy, paste in Revit. And he's like, there's got to be a better way to model these things. So what's interesting is TestFit is being sold to developers because architects are like, this could take over my work. We don't want to use it. And developers are like, yay, I don't have to use the architects. If I use this, I'm going to start using this tool. So it's being sold directly to developers. He's found more traction with developers. But essentially, for any building with replicable units, whether it's housing, whether it's storage shed, whether it's parking, you can put in the parameters of saying, like I know I was able to do one desk critique of the third year, and in the program for this museum that they're working on, it says you have to have 150 parking units, right? So you can put in the parameters, or you can drag in the local building code. You can show them, tell me all the different configurations to fit 150 parking spaces on this site. And you can drag and drop the outline around, and it'll use AI to adjust given the parameters you give it. So it's really cool. This is going beyond. So these are people where VC funding has been invested. This is Amazon VC funding into the AEC space by people who have no background in architecture. So Plant Prefab just finished building one of the biggest prefabricated plants in Central California, which literally prints out almost like elevations for these big prefabricated models. The guy that was interested in it was he's the founder of Steve Glenn. He founded Living Homes, which was one of the first, he did the first prefabricated platinum-rated LEED home in Santa Monica. But he's gotten funding from Amazon and others to kind of look at how do we do this at scale. They have a really interesting video if you go to their website to look at how they incorporate the wiring and everything and the window openings and drop it into the elevations, and then how it gets shipped to the site. But again, this is now money that is being invested in the AEC space into companies that were started by people that don't have a background in architecture, that are now hiring architects outside of firms to work for them. Same thing with Mighty Buildings. So Mighty Buildings is interesting. They were one of the first 3D printed buildings. They were trying to do these 3D printed ADUs, and then they figured out it's really, they were 3D printing on site and then shipping them like shipping containers, prefab, to the site. And they changed their business model. They pivoted. So now they pre-print 3D panels, and then they ship the panels to the site, and they have a lot more different configurations for their buildings. that way. So they are out of Oakland, California. This was started by my friend in business school. Again, no background in architecture. They don't even have a single architect on their leadership team, but this is a technology company that is influencing how buildings are being built in our local community up in Northern California, and they have architects on staff. Same thing with Cottage. Cottage is a technology platform that hires architects as 1099 contractors. So that means that they actually don't employ architects. They hire them as if part-time or even full-time. But essentially, you are not an employee of the firm. You're a contractor of the firm, so you're still in charge of your own healthcare, et cetera. But it's different models that are being spun up that are hiring architects out of architecture firms to support these technology companies for people that actually don't have an interest or that didn't previously have an interest or background in architecture. So I think it's just interesting to see who is behind some of these ideas. And it's sad for me to see that a lot of them aren't actually coming from architects, that they're coming from tech people. So beyond architecture. So the majority of these people, by the way, are on the podcast. You can find our episode. So when we talk about different career paths in architecture, and people ask like, oh, how do you what are other paths that you can take? A lot of people talk about going into the manufacturer side, going into the product rep side, going into the owner's side. This is really meant to talk about what are architects that are truly doing other things. So Rebecca Bookbinder is a fellow SciArc grad. She's for all intents and purposes, she's world building. So she is an art director for Lucasfilms. One of the latest projects that she worked on was Boba Fett. So she gets to be on site with the actors every day. We talked about how quick the iteration process is for entertainment and movie production. Like if they need something built, she can sketch it out, and 2 days later it will be built on site, and the actors will be acting in front of it and sometimes walking on top of it. So it's just really interesting when you think how long it takes a building to get built and how quickly they respond on the production side. Trinity Simmons is a past AIAS national president. She is the executive director for the Mayor's Institute on City Design. And what they do is they bring together mayors from different cities across the US to talk to them about the importance of good design within their cities. So she's more on the community side of things. Jacob Day is also a past AIAS president. It's really interesting to see all of these past AIA national presidents. I think I know like 1 or 2 out of the 20 I know that have actually remained in practice. A lot of the AIAS national presidents have gone on to do other things. So Jacob Day is one of them. He actually enlisted after he was AIAS president, and then he came back and he was governor in Salisbury, Maryland, and now he is secretary for the Department of Housing and Community Development there. I think if any architect has a chance of being president or senator or something higher up, Jacob is definitely one to watch. He's on that trajectory. Natasha Case she was a Disney Imagineer, and she has an architecture degree, I want to say from USC, but she loved baking and she loved cooking, and she would bring baked goods to all of her Imagineer friends, and they're like, you should do this for a living. So she was in LA before food trucks completely blew up, and she was selling these, she's since renamed her ice cream sandwiches, but her ice cream sandwiches, like she had a Mies, and she had a Gary ice cream sandwich, but it was all architecturally related. She now owns one of the first ice cream companies to go entirely vegan. She's in Whole Foods across the nation, but she is an architect that has gone on to do other things. She hasn't been on my podcast, but I have talked to her numerous times about how She's used architecture to leverage her build-outs, but she's also used architecture to really come up with the graphic identity for Cool House. And she's used it from a systems thinking perspective in terms of how to grow her business. Andrea was a Columbia grad. She went on Shark Tank while she was still a student at Columbia, and they got funded for this Illuminate. It was a light that they were doing, where essentially it's a solar-powered light. It now powers your cell phone, but another architect kind of who has gone on to do other things. Vivian Lin was on Good Morning America for this. During the pandemic, she was at Raphael Viñoly in New York. She saw, though, that they had stopped composting in the boroughs to move that money to focus on supporting the pandemic initiative. So she decided, well, how can I create a compost, a full circle compost loop in my neighborhood? So she went out to the farmers, and essentially she created this loop where you get delivered a fresh CSA box every week to your door, and they take away your compost back to the farm. So it's this closed loop thing, and it literally took off so fast that in like 4 weeks, she left Raphael Viñoly and made it her full-time job. So I know a few of you have seen Dammy. Have any of you watched Dammy? Okay, so I think she's up to like 750,000 subscribers on YouTube. So she is an architect out of Vancouver that is an amazing storyteller. And what's interesting with Dammy is she started off just doing interviews. I was one of her first interviews back in 2020. We've stayed in touch ever since. Now she makes all of her money off of YouTube, and she picks and chooses what, she only does 1 or 2 projects a year, and she gets those clients through her YouTube channel. But what's interesting about Dammy's channel is that she's really figured out how to tell stories about architecture in a way that attracts the general public. So she's getting a lot of people outside of architecture talking about architecture. She did a really great rundown of the Sphere, and she also looks at kind of more historic context of architecture and how movies like Blade Runner were influenced by architectural design. Cameron Cruz is a SCAD grad out of Georgia. When she married her partner, he was in the Army, and she found it was really hard to find a job that allowed her to move to place with her spouse. So she started a network of Army wives that sew together these various different pieces of handbags, and then they kind of ship it to one collective place where it all gets put together. She was also on Shark Tank, and our Riveter is like a very successful company now. They have really great bags, but it's, again, a story of an architect who is trying to figure out how to make her way doing other things. How many of you knew that the founder of TED was an architect? One person. So D stands for design, I think in tech, right? Technology, education, and design. TED was founded by Richard Saul Wurman, who was actually a dean at the University of Cal Poly Riverside. I want to say Cal Poly Riverside. Before he left to found TED. So this is kind of an architect that is doing, that is taking his love of education and storytelling and technology to a much broader stage. And then Melody Yashar has been on the podcast. She works for Icon. Icon is a general contractor, but they don't like to call themselves a general contractor. They like to call themselves a contracting technologies company or building technologies company. They are building 3D printed homes for partnering with the likes of Freda out in Austin, Texas. But they also have several contracts with NASA. So she is literally a space architect. So what's interesting about space and about all of the materials that you think about that create a building is it's really hard. It would be really hard to ship materials to space, and then it would take a lot of labor to build those materials into a building. So what ICON is doing is it's testing debris from the moon to see how they can use the material on the moon and turn it into a 3D print material for buildings on the moon. So all they have to do is essentially ship ahead a robot that can 3D print an enclosure, and there will be an enclosure built then before astronauts even move into the enclosure. And that's the thing she's actually working on with NASA. They've literally built one of these in Houston. They built an enclosure in Houston, a livable space in Houston, and 3 astronauts have decided to had volunteered to lock themselves into this habitat for a year to see how they handle mentally, and so they can make adjustments to the design over time. But it's really interesting to talk to her because she talks about interterrestrial versus terrestrial architecture, and I never really thought I would be having those conversations with any architects. But yeah, they're doing a lot of interesting things. ICON also just released, just last week, a new technology which allows anyone to input some ideas around a house design and output a house design. So they're beginning to play around with that. It's a free platform. Go visit the website ICON and check it out too. And then it's talking, Jenny Wu, she and her partner, who's her partner again? Yeah. So she has actually a well-known practice. She's a professor at SCI-Arc. She has a well-known practice, Wu Oliver Collective in Los Angeles. But a while ago, like 4 or 5 years ago, she started doing this 3D printed jewelry. She makes more money from her jewelry collection than she does as faculty at SCI-Arc, and then she does as an architect doing, a lot of them are residential, but she does have some community projects as well. And she's kind of not shy about it. She's like, the margins in jewelry making are a lot better than the profit margins in architecture. So she still is very much rooted in architecture, but lace is where she's making all of her money from. I think that was my last slide. Oh, a few more. So I know I haven't talked tremendous amount about AI, but this is kind of a slide that I like to put in here. So 60% of CEOs believe that the current business model is at risk of disruption, mostly because of technology, and they're looking to figure out how they change it within the next 3 years. And unfortunately, architects don't have a big background in business, so we're not as active about considering how to change the business model when we are in the midst of practice. And that's what I'm really focused on, is helping architects create new business models so we can actually, pay people better and change the culture that we have in our firms. And then this is, I don't know if you all have heard this. This came out in the last month, but Sam Altman, who's the CEO of OpenAI, said in my little group chat with my tech CEO friends, there's a betting pool on when the first unicorn company or one-person billion-dollar company will happen, and he believes that can happen with AI. So if you're thinking about new business models and the ability to make money, technology is enabling that in a way that it never has previously. And I think that's it. That's the end.